Welcome to Lincoln Log, where we speak with leading historians and other officials about their stories, research, and wisdom. Expand your knowledge and indulge your curiosity here on Lincoln Log. This podcast is produced by the Abraham Lincoln Association, aiding and promoting Abraham Lincoln's life and legacy. Founded in 1908, the ALA remains the nation's oldest and largest Lincoln organization. Learn more at abrahamlincolnassociation.org. Greetings. I am your host, Joshua Claiborne, and I am pleased to welcome Dan McLaughlin to our Lincoln Log podcast. Dan is a senior writer at National Review Online. He was formerly an attorney practicing securities and commercial litigation in New York City, a contributing editor of Red State, columnist at The Federalist and The New Ledger, a baseball blogger at baseballcrank.com, bostonsportsguy.com, and Providence Journal Online, as well as a contributor to the Command Post. His writings on politics, baseball, and law have appeared in numerous other newspapers, magazines, websites, and legal journals. Dan, thank you for joining the podcast.
Great to be here.
You recently authored a piece in National Review titled "The Confederate Roots of the Administrative State." Of course, we all have to agree that the administrative state has grown exponentially in America over the past century, much of it without roots in our Constitution. And you argue that this bureaucratic, unelected, managerial government had its birthplace in the Confederate States of America, and then the system was ultimately imported into the theory and practice of the federal government by Woodrow Wilson. I want to give you a chance to sort of elaborate on your column and maybe some of the other, potentially even specific examples of how Wilson advanced the Confederate government philosophy.
Yeah, so I think there's a bit of an uneven history to the administrative state in the United States, particularly in the federal government. Obviously, this is focusing more on the national than the state governments. But prior to 1861, the administrative state in the United States was very small. The federal government had only about, I think, around 4,500 employees, other than outside of the military and the post office. And even the military was about 10,000 people, and a few thousand others in the post office. So the number of bureaucrats that you had was quite small. The Justice Department didn't exist, for example. The Attorney General did not oversee really law enforcement in the United States. The Attorney General was principally there to advise the president. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you had the constitutional structure that we had for that period, and that's still at least written down, was one of very strict separation of powers, where the president had essentially total control over the executive branch. There was, extensive political control, and that expanded under Andrew Jackson, the so-called spoils system, in which, huge numbers of the appointees to the federal government were political. They could be removed by the president. And that was all, stuff that went back to not only to Madison and the Constitution, but to John Adams, mm-hmm. And the Massachusetts Constitution, to Montesquieu. We've had three moments of national constitution writing in America. And I'm leaving aside, the Vermont and Texas constitutions, which I think were singles, even when they were independent republics. They were sort of expected, not necessarily to be long-term national projects, right? So you have the Articles of Confederation in 1777. You have the Great Convention of Philadelphia in 1787, and then in the spring of 1861 in Montgomery, Alabama, you have the writing of the Confederate Constitution. And it's interesting because if you sit down and read the Confederate Constitution, some of it, of course, is, they literally started with the U.S. Constitution as their model. All of the Confederacy's laws essentially were, well, let's just take whatever, we already know and is familiar, mm-hmm. and then adapt it based on specific things we want to do. And so some of what was changed obviously was to strengthen the protections of slavery in very explicit ways. Some of what was changed by the committee, which was essentially dominated by a handful of Georgians, some of what was changed by the committee was, very specific grievances that the South had about states' rights and tariffs and things of that nature to offer some strengthening of states against the national Confederate government. But the other set of revisions that were made are very interesting to study, because what they really did was to reduce the separation of powers and at the same time reduce the president's control over the executive branch. So the president is term limited. First of all, his term is extended to 6 years, but he's term limited. So Jefferson Davis never had to think about reelection. Everything that he did, essentially, he didn't have to face the voters again. But that also meant that he was sort of, in political terms, kind of a lame duck from the day he took office. One of the chief changes is that it made explicit what had always been implicit in American practice, which is that cabinet officers and the diplomats could be removed at will by the president, but the rest of the civil service, the executive branch, could only be removed for cause. This is a brand new thing. This is not in the U.S. Constitution. There were also revisions to allow Congress to permit cabinet secretaries to sit on the floor of the Confederate House and essentially act as, in the way that members of the British cabinet could. Robert Toombs, who was the Confederate Secretary of State, I think was probably the moving force behind this. He was a great admirer of the British parliamentary system. They never ended up enacting that. There were a number of things in Confederate theory that never ended up in Confederate practice. For example, the Confederate Constitution authorizes a Supreme Court. They never got around to having one. So some of that changed in practice. There's a line item veto. There are, in fact, the Confederate legislature could not appropriate any funds except for itself, for its own operations, and for the judgment fund. Those are the only two things on which the Confederate Congress was permitted to appropriate funds that weren't requested by either the president or the heads of executive departments. So it gave much more presidential control over the budget. And so what you have in the theory of the Confederate government, in its design, is a strengthening of the executive at the expense of the legislature, but at the same time, a weakening of the president within the executive branch. And then what happens next is from theory to practice. And we often hear in our histories about the expansion of government that happened in the Union during the war, right? And obviously Lincoln and his government did not always stick by the principles they believed in, under the stresses of wartime, as has been, fairly a common thing for wartime governments anywhere, that some of the small government free market things that Lincoln wanted to do didn't exactly end up that way. But by and large, the expansion of government in the Union during the war was really dwarfed by the expansion of government, federal government, in the Confederacy. You had a huge number of these boards and bureaus, and part of this was, again, exigencies of wartime, right? The Confederacy does not have the industrial base that the Union has. Right. It has a much smaller manpower base, particularly because, nearly 40% of the population is slaves, and only at the very, very end of the war do they even consider arming them, and that probably was not a good idea for, what the Confederates were trying to accomplish anyway. So you have a smaller population, and a much smaller manpower base. And so the Confederacy needs to take steps to much more aggressively marshal its resources. And so you have this enormous growth of the administrative state. One of the things they do over a year before the Union does, they institute the draft, first military draft in American history. But it's different. The Union's draft, both drafts had certain features like the ability to buy your way out with a substitute. But what the Confederacy does, because its draft is essentially it's going to draft everybody, right? They end up, between volunteers and conscripts, they end up with about 75% of the white men of military age of the Confederacy end up serving in the military. So this is enormous effort to get men under arms. And there are occupational exemptions. And all of these, the War Department bureaus, and there's like 57,000 employees just in the War Department. And the War Department bureaus essentially use this as leverage to control a huge amount of the economy. Because if you can dictate, where people can and can't work, you're essentially centrally planning your economy. And then on top of that, the wartime industries, in the Union, you've got the requisitioning, you have essentially military contractors, right? A military industrial complex and of a primitive sort. And even you have, guys like Thaddeus Stevens, who's, steering war contracts to his own foundries and such. All of the usual kind of shenanigans that you have in a democratic system. But in the Confederacy, you have very, very limited industries before the wartime, war-related industries before the war starts. And so the War Department is essentially running like munitions factories and they don't nationalize the railroads, but they nationalize, essentially control the railroads. They do nationalize the telegraph. They're nationalizing, factories to make all sorts of weaponry. So there's a pervasive control, and all of this has to be done through bureaucracy.
And you believe this ultimately appealed to Woodrow Wilson, and that he started to incorporate that into his plans and designs and hopes for the federal government as well, then, is what you would say?
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that Wilson, because a lot of this recedes after the war, right? The Union dismantles a good deal of its own administrative structure. The Confederate government is, of course, gone with the wind, so to speak. And so Wilson, and there are in the interim between 1865 and Wilson's election in 1912, there are some steps taken towards the growth of an administrative state. We have the Interstate Commerce Commission. We have the civil service reforms that followed James Garfield's assassination, where there start to be more employees insulated from political control. So there are some developments going on there. So Woodrow Wilson he's born in 1856. He grows up in the Confederacy and in Reconstruction. He lives, in the South until he's 30. Other than attending Princeton, he's sufficiently. His father sides with the Confederacy. He sees in person Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee when he's a young child, and so Wilson is very much a creature of the South, and as we'll see, his a lot of his attitudes about race, certainly, and not only about race, but also his mistrust of Congress. I think a lot of that is not only of a piece with the antebellum, the postbellum South, the Reconstruction era South, but is specifically influenced by his dislike of Reconstruction, right? And Reconstruction is very much driven in the period, after Lincoln's assassination. Reconstruction is driven by Congress, and it is the fights between Congress and the executive branch are very much ones in which the interests of the South are against what Congress is doing, right? Congress is imposing Reconstruction on the South in ways that are not popular. And so Wilson in the 1870s and 1880s, as he develops into a scholar, is writing these articles, essentially blasting congressional government and how terrible it is to have the government run by congressional committees, that they're too responsive to popular opinion, and this is very much, tied to, I think, it's his own theoretical work, but it's impossible to miss the influence there of Wilson's dislike of congressional Reconstruction. And he also, he writes in some of his academic work and his treatises He writes about even the idea not only that executive administration in his landmark essay in 1887 on the administrative state, not only about congressional government being too responsive to popular opinion, but that popular opinion is too difficult to manage because of the essentially racial and ethnic diversity of the United States. So a lot of this it seeps into his attitudes in a lot of different ways. He writes. He is a student of the Confederate Constitution. He has like an entire, in one of his history books, he has a whole side-by-side comparison of the U.S. Constitution, and he speaks approvingly of some of the innovations that are made specifically on the separation of powers front. So this is I think a pervasive influence on Wilson. It's not the only influence. He's also a great admirer of the Prussian system, and we have at this point in time, there's more growth of administrative unelected government in Europe certainly than there is in the United States.
Well, yeah, and I guess on that point, let me play devil's advocate on a couple issues. I mean, first, where does this leave the previous 40 years of history before Wilson, when the administrative state was developing? I mean, we've got 50 years of civil service reform and U.S. government growth, really under Republicans, you could point out, and maybe some would argue then that the administrative would have expanded even more under Theodore Roosevelt than Wilson at that period of time, just given the trajectory of it going. I mean, how would you respond to those arguments? And I know I saw many critics lob those arguments in response to your column too.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I'm not trying to argue that this is the sole and only origin story of the administrative state, but I think it's a hugely important part of it, because there is this prior experience, and it is something that Wilson grows up around, that Wilson studies in his work, and so I think it is a very large influence on Wilson. I honestly think I mean, the hard part with Teddy Roosevelt, frankly, is that you have the Teddy Roosevelt who's a Republican president, and then you have the Teddy Roosevelt of 1912, right? And Roosevelt has shifted a lot in the years that he's been out of the White House. He's much more radical. And so, to say, well, if Roosevelt stayed another 4 years in office or something is one thing. To say if Roosevelt gets reelected, if Roosevelt gets elected in 1912, that may be a very different story. The other thing, though, on the other hand, Roosevelt was much more of a presidential power guy, mm-hmm. I think, more so than an administrative state guy. He was not, at least I mean, I think he certainly was a guy who was growing some of the administrative powers of the government, but he was not a devoted theorist of unelected bureaucracy. Roosevelt believed much more in presidential control than Wilson,
obviously. Yeah. And you make the case too. I think you freely admit that. Look, there's a lot of other governments in the free world, Europe in particular, that ended up growing an administrative state without a confederacy. So, in some ways, maybe it was inevitable with or without the Confederacy, but that nonetheless, the Confederate approach to the administrative state was still a big influence on Woodrow Wilson, and that because of that, he certainly helped advance its cause and maybe even speed it up. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
Yeah, although the caveat I would offer there to when we talk about the free world is to remember that the free world in 1912 was still the United States, Britain, and only a handful of it was most. I mean, you did have France was a republic by that point, but huge amounts of continental Europe, I think, and you could argue this certainly with France with the Napoleonic system. Even huge amounts of Europe developed administrative state structures well before they had popularly elected governments. Mm-hmm. So in those situations, the development of an administrative state is actually prior to the development of, say, a written constitution. I mean, the British in the era of Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, the British had actually a very small government. Shockingly so, in fact, for how large an empire they were governing around the world.
Right. Right. Well, an important takeaway from me from your piece, I don't think you're trying to make sort of what one might call the genetic fallacy or guilt by association and say, look, because the Confederates embraced this bureaucratic state and Wilson embraced it, that therefore makes him guilty by association for that reason. But I do think that the Confederacy, as you point out, was a central government that incurred massive debt while imposing massive taxes. It had a virtual monopoly on foreign trade. It maintained de facto control over raw materials and labor and transportation. Jefferson Davis often invoked martial law in parts of the Confederacy, allowing military commanders to make, I think you point this out, arbitrary arrests, controlled travel, fixed prices, all that. And so, but war was an obvious factor in that sort of hypocrisy, you could say, where they're claiming to be small government and they're not. War was an important factor of that. Do you think the Confederate bureaucratic system would have continued, let's say, hypothetically and theoretically they'd won the war, 1870, 1880, would they have, you think, reverted back to some sort of small government, state-centered type of approach? Or do you think that bureaucracy was there to stay regardless?
Yeah, I mean, there's two separate questions, obviously, which is one, what does the Confederacy look like if the Union lets it go peacefully and you don't have this development of a wartime state? And the other is what happens if they win, they survive. And I think in the latter case, certainly, Richard Franklin Bensel, whose book Yankee Leviathan is one of the major sources that I was, drawing on, and he certainly argues that, that the threads of administrative control had wormed themselves so deeply into Southern society during the war that it would have been hard to tear it all up by the roots, and it was making some fundamental changes. On the other hand, you have to remember too that the Southern states before the war, had some small government principles on which they opposed the rest of the country in terms of tariffs, in terms of internal improvements. But at the same time, the state structure of protecting slavery also involved an awful lot of state control and state control of, state control of the mail, state control of travel, state control of the press in ways that were out of step with the North. So I think the principles, there were certainly principles, and there were principled people in the Confederate government for their own species of principle. I mean, somebody like Alexander Stephens, is in some ways kind of the ideal of the principled politician if you set aside the actual substance of his principles. But instead, which is why Stephens, even though he's one of the architects of this Constitution, ends up as a fairly staunch critic of the administration in which he was serving as vice president. But yeah, I think had they survived the war, they would have come out of it a more administrative structure than the Union, just because of what the experience had been, and probably because what they would have needed going forward for the Confederate States of America to remain an independent going concern. They were going to continue to need state control to protect slavery. They were probably going to need, for a significant period of time, a stronger military. They didn't have the natural, defenses of the oceans and whatnot that the United States had. And I think there was probably a fair amount of predatory interest at that point on the part of Britain and France and whatnot to go after. Perhaps go after Confederate interests.
Right. Well, this is the Lincoln Log podcast, and so we focus on Abraham Lincoln. Our listeners are interested in him. So just want to shift a little bit to get your thoughts on some of the aspects of him relating to war. He's often criticized for suspending habeas corpus, which many consider an unconstitutional act. How do you view his actions as it relates to the suspension of habeas corpus and whether it was, constitutional or not?
Yeah, I think obviously there is a contrast there to Jefferson Davis because, both of them fairly extensively use those kind of wartime powers. And I think Davis, as you noted, did use like sort of the creation of martial law more extensively than Lincoln, for rational reasons, because the territory he was governing was much more under invasion. At the same time, Davis, unlike Lincoln, did not suspend the writ until he had a congressional approval to do so. I think that's a debate that it's kind of a never-ending debate, but I think the fact that both of them were taking similar steps at the same time is an illustration of the wartime necessity to do this, that the circumstances of a civil war are naturally going to lead to some loss of civil liberties, even that some civil liberties that would be more easily protected during a foreign war, just because the front is all over the place, and there was Confederate espionage and sabotage, and people trying to take ships and go off on these various kind of privateering expeditions. I mean, there were people arrested in California for plots to try to secede, and so there was, and there were raids coming in through the Canadian border. So it's a fairly extensive challenge that Lincoln is dealing with.
Well, Professor Alan Gelza, who's actually been on this podcast before, notes that the suspension is not spelled out clearly in the Constitution who can do that, and so one could argue that the president has that prerogative, not Congress. Now, the fact that it is in Article 1, I think, is a strong suggestion that was with Congress, but then Congress was in recess, not in session, and that wasn't going to happen for a while. And so to the extent you felt like it was necessary during an insurrection or war, I think that was probably Lincoln's justification, or would be Lincoln's ultimate legal justification for doing it without Congress.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And he did go to Congress once he had Congress back in session to go to. I mean, Lincoln, one of the interesting things about Lincoln, I think, looking back, is that I don't think there's ever been an American administration that was more thoroughly staffed with lawyers than the Lincoln administration. You look at the cabinet, he's got people like Seward and Stanton. I think like more than half of his cabinet was lawyers. Lincoln's a lawyer. I think Hamlin was a lawyer. Andrew Johnson was a lawyer. So there's lawyers all over this administration, and they do have, they think these things through. They're not sort of doing this on the fly.
One of the things that I think tends to unite intellectuals on both the left and the right occasionally is this belief that Lincoln was, in some important ways, a father of modern liberalism. I don't know that I fully agree with that. I wouldn't really place him as either conservative or liberal quite that easily, but rather as an acolyte of the Declaration of Independence, one who saw really the Civil War, maybe not as an opportunity, but certainly that during that time that it was, with the freeing of the slaves, the full flowering of the Declaration's true promise. I'm curious how you view Lincoln, whether you see him sort of in that conservative liberal box one way or the other. And would you agree he's the father of modern liberalism? If not, why not?
Well, I think that I think you can place where Lincoln is, and then argue over where other people are in relation to him. I think Lincoln is absolutely and unquestionably a classical liberal within the political map of the 1850s and 1860s. He's actually pretty easy to isolate or to locate, and he is one of the most one of the most consistent classical liberals of his age, even when you compare him to the British politicians of his time, to Seward or Grant, to even somebody like Benito Juarez, who is kind of the chief sort of classical liberal on the North American continent outside of the U.S. And at the same time, Lincoln was not afraid to embrace at times the label of conservative, or at least to argue that his policies and his views were conservative in some ways. At the Cooper Union speech, he does this very effectively, talking about the tried and familiar. and I don't think Lincoln saw himself as a conservative, but he saw some of the things he was doing as justifiable and important within a conservative worldview. Obviously, in that time period, conservative was sort of very much a small c word that you would get used sometimes for those kind of Burkean concepts, but conservative in the 1850s and 1860s tended much more to be a term that was used to mean the real throne and altar conservatism of Europe. I mean, my argument long term is that the Republican Party of his era, and I think this is has been true for much of the party's history, and it's much more controversial maybe to argue at this present moment, but for much of the party's history, there has always been this kind of fusionist strain running through the party between the classical liberal sort of ideals that are general in their application and some of the less immediately ideological conservative strains that have run through the party. And in Lincoln's time, that's you have the there's a strain of nationalism in foreign policy, which Seward is very much Seward is a nationalist. He has some classical liberal ideas as well, but his foreign policy ideas are very expansionist. And he's more or less, he kind of crosses swords constantly with Palmerston in England because in a sense the two of them have almost too much in common.
Yeah.
And Grant, I think, is in some ways more of a nationalist and more of a Christian moralist, actually. We don't think of Grant in those terms, but he's very much a Victorian era Methodist. And so you have those strains, and you have that even in Lincoln, the incorporation of the Know Nothings, who are very much a kind of America First sort of faction within the party, and Lincoln brings them in. He doesn't think much of them, but he tolerates them. And you have the protective tariffs, which is not really what you would call a classical liberal thing. And so, I think that Lincoln his sympathies are deeply classical liberal. And whether you consider today's liberals or conservatives to be heirs of Lincoln, I think depends very much on how much you think that they are or are not classically liberal. That you can look at Republicans today and Donald Trump, and and sort of see some of his points of departure from classical liberalism. Obviously, any sort of modern progressivism is hard to square with the classical liberals of the 19th century. But in his own time, Lincoln is not hard to isolate as not only the kind of almost ideal classical liberal, but more classically liberal even than a lot of his own party.
Right. Lincoln's considered, as we all know, one of the best, if not the best, American presidents. I'm curious what you think accounts for his greatness. Did the Civil War amplify those attributes, or would we still have considered him a great president if the Civil War had not occurred?
There's always has to be a marriage of the man and the moment, and to be a great president, to be one of the true great presidents usually requires you to surmount great challenges. And certainly I would put Lincoln, it's sort of one and two between Lincoln and Washington is an endless debate because they had different kinds of challenges. Washington had to kind of create the presidency after it was more or less written around him. But there's no question that that's your top two, however you order them. I think Lincoln had to learn on the job. He was actually remarkably inexperienced in some ways, but he had a diversity of experiences.
Right.
And I think it was more a matter of character. And the fact that he had thought through what he believed in. The other thing that I think is important to remember about Lincoln, and you appreciate this more when you compare him to the other world leaders of his day too. Lincoln was remarkably forward-looking and sophisticated about technology. If you look at, newspapers are another major development, that they grow explosively in the decades that parallel Lincoln's rise to prominence. And if you look at Lincoln's communications, I mean, he's tremendous in these long form debates and long form speeches. But as he goes to become the president, as he gets more in the habit of communicating through the telegraph, his messages, his speeches, his letters become much more concise. And again, that's partly the press of business. But I think the miracle of things like the Second Inaugural and the Gettysburg Address, which are these magisterial speeches, which are like a couple of paragraphs. You can put out the entire Gettysburg Address in like 6 tweets, right? So, and I think the discipline of working with the telegraph actually made Lincoln more concise in the way that he communicated. And so I think you have all of these different strands of his career in which you can see his sophistication about technology and his willingness to rethink what is possible, what can be done.
Right. Well, we often like to end these podcasts by asking guests this question, so I'm going to ask it for you. What is a favorite Lincoln story or anecdote that you might have?
I think to me the thing that I keep going back to a lot, and this is part of being a conservative writer in this particular time, is just Lincoln's, Lincoln as the leader of a coalition, Lincoln as a guy who understands how to build a brand new party. Mm-hmm. And so it's the entire scope of all of his efforts to bring together these kind of fractious groups, the former Whigs, you've got the Know-Nothings. Some of my favorite Lincoln stuff to read, of course, is his attacks on the Dred Scott decision, which are very lawyerly, but also very inspiring in how he, how he invokes the framers. So I think that's the period that is in some ways the most interesting to me, and the theme that is in some ways most interesting to me is Lincoln from 1857 to 1861, like putting together that coalition and managing it in a way that gets everybody on board with and builds for the first time this majority party in the North. Right.
Well, Dan, I appreciate you coming on and chatting about your column and some of your views and thoughts and insights into the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. Please keep up the good work, whether you're a liberal or conservative. I think you prompt people to think and certainly spark good dialogue. And if you're interested in beyond politics, obviously we mentioned at the outset, but you are a baseball guy, not to be confused with the famous St. Louis announcer, I assume, of the same name, right?
Yeah, no relation, but I do get people looking for him and finding me instead on Twitter a good deal.
Are you a Cardinals fan, or who's your team of choice?
No, I am a lifelong, long-suffering Mets fan.
Oh, okay. All right. Great. All right. Well, again, I appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Lincoln Log. You can subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. And if you like this podcast, please consider rating it on iTunes and leaving a review. This helps other people find the show.